When I pulled into my Texas ranch after a long business trip, I expected dust silence, maybe the comfort of routine. Instead, I heard the violent crash of drywall collapsing from inside my own living room. I stepped out of the car and saw strangers swinging sledgehammers like they belonged there. And near the doorway stood my father, calm as ever, telling me the house was being expanded for my sister's growing family. That was the moment everything shifted and none of us would ever be the same again. I remember standing there in the middle of torn drywall and floating dust, trying to understand how my own house had turned into a construction site without a single conversation. My father kept repeating that the expansion was necessary, that Camille needed space before the baby arrived, as if that sentence alone could erase the fact that I hadn't agreed to any of this. I asked him a simple question: who gave permission? He didn't answer it directly. He just said it was handled. That word lingered in the air longer than the sound of the hammer strikes. My mother wouldn't even look at me. She waved one of the workers forward and told him to keep going, like my confusion was just background noise, like I was the one interrupting something already decided. That's when the pressure in my chest shifted from shock to something sharper. I walked outside and called the construction company. Their sign was planted right into my lawn, bold and confident. When the representative answered, his tone was relaxed, professional, completely unaware that anything was wrong. I asked him to confirm the authorization. There was a brief pause as he pulled up the file. Then he read the name on the contract, Camille Harper. Hearing my sister's full name spoken so casually by a stranger did something I wasn't prepared for. It wasn't just surprise, it was a slow realization that my absence hadn't been accidental timing. It had been useful. I asked him who signed the agreement. He told me it had been submitted with a signed contract and all required documents. Everything appeared valid. I ended the call and walked back inside, where another section of my living room wall had already been reduced to debris. I confronted my father immediately. I told him the contract had Camille's name attached to it. He didn't look startled. He didn't look confused. He looked irritated. He said Camille was overwhelmed, that she had a lot on her plate, that I should show more understanding instead of making the situation harder than it needed to be. Harder. I asked to see the contract. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough to confirm what I already suspected. Then he told me the company could send me a copy. I called them again and requested the scanned document. When the email came through, my hands were steady, but only because I was forcing them to be. I opened the file and stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was my name. The handwriting looked almost identical to mine at first glance. The same looping M. The same slight angle in the last letter of my last name. For a split second, I felt disoriented, like I was looking at something I had signed and forgotten. But the longer I studied it, the more the illusion cracked. The curves were too deliberate. The pressure in certain strokes was inconsistent. My real signature has a rhythm to it, quick, fluid, unconscious. This one looked careful, practiced, like someone had traced it in their mind 100 times before committing it to paper. Someone had taken the time to replicate me. That realization was heavier than the construction noise ever could have been. I showed it to my mother first. She barely glanced at it before telling me I was overreacting. She said Camille wouldn't do something malicious, that this was just paperwork and I was making it into something dramatic. Just paperwork. I asked her if she understood that My name had been forged on a legal contract to authorize structural changes to property that belongs solely to me. She sighed, like I was exhausting her. My father stepped in again, saying that families help each other, that the expansion was for the baby, that I had more space than I needed anyway. I tried to explain that this wasn't about space. It wasn't about generosity. It was about consent, about ownership, about someone signing my name without asking me. They kept reframing it as emotional, as temporary stress, as something that would have worked itself out if I hadn't made it an issue. That's when something inside me went still, because if this had been a misunderstanding, there would have been confusion, apologies, even awkward explanations. Instead, there was coordination, there was preparation. There was a signed contract submitted while I was out of town, workers scheduled, materials delivered. This wasn't impulsive. They had waited until I was gone. I replayed the timeline in my head. The business trip had been planned months in advance. Camille knew about it. My parents knew about it. The work had started the day after I left. That detail settled everything. They hadn't wanted my opinion. They had wanted my absence. I stood in my partially dismantled living room and realized that the biggest fracture in that house wasn't the wall behind me. It was trust. And it hadn't cracked by accident. It had been chipped away carefully, quietly, intentionally. The forged signature wasn't a desperate mistake made in panic. It required effort. It required copying samples. It required submitting documents to a company and presenting them as legitimate. And at some point during that process, no one stopped and thought maybe we should ask her. Or maybe they did think about it and decided not to. That was the part that lingered long after the noise settled for the evening. The understanding that this wasn't a chaotic misunderstanding fueled by pregnancy hormones or family stress. It was a decision made in my absence, built on the assumption that I would either accept it or be pressured into silence. Standing there, holding that scanned contract, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit. This wasn't about helping Camille. It was about believing my boundaries didn't matter. That night after the house finally went quiet and the workers packed up their tools, I sat alone at my kitchen table, staring at the scanned contract on my laptop. I kept zooming in on the signature as if another glance might magically turn it into mine. It never did. The more I looked at it, the more deliberate it felt. By the next morning, I knew I couldn't handle this alone. I called my attorney, Avery Collins, and told her I needed to see her immediately. I didn't dramatize it. I just said there were documents signed in my name that I hadn't signed, and construction had already begun on my property. There was a pause on the line before she responded, and in that pause, I could feel the shift from casual consultation to something more serious. When I arrived at her office, I brought everything: emails, the contract screenshots of the company's confirmation, even notes I had written to myself about the timeline. My voice felt strangely steady as I explained what had happened. I walked her through the business trip, the workers, my father's explanation, the phone call confirming Camille's name on the authorization. Avery didn't interrupt. She listened the way someone does when they know the details matter. Then she opened the contract, as small as a notarized form from years. As small as a notarized form from years earlier. She placed them side by side, her expression tightening in small, controlled ways. "The resemblance is intentional," she said quietly. That sentence landed differently than anything my parents had said. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't defensive. It was clinical. That forged signatures often look almost perfect at first glance because they're created slowly with care, whereas genuine ones are fluid, shaped by habit rather than calculation. Hearing that felt surreal. This wasn't a family disagreement about space or generosity. This was my sister attempting to replicate my identity on a legal document. Avery then shifted to the construction permits. She reviewed the submission dates, the listed applicant name, the scope of work described in the plans. Her questions became sharper. Were you informed of any of this beforehand? No. Did you give written or verbal consent at any point? No. Did you authorize Camille to act on your behalf? Absolutely not. She leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly. This moves beyond family conflict, she said. Using a falsified signature to initiate construction on property you solely own could qualify as fraud. At minimum, it's a misuse of legal documentation and unauthorized alteration of private property. Fraud. The word felt heavy. Final. Up until that moment, a part of me had still been trying to soften it in my own mind. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was pressure. Maybe it was misunderstanding layered with bad judgment. But fraud isn't a misunderstanding. It's a decision. Avery continued explaining the potential implications. If the signature was proven forged, it meant the contract itself was invalid. Any permits obtained under that authorization could be subject to review. And because multiple people appeared involved, including whoever submitted and processed the paperwork, the situation carried more weight than a single impulsive act. I sat there, absorbing it, feeling the strange duality of relief and grief. Relief that someone was finally treating this as serious. Grief that the people potentially responsible were my own family. There's something uniquely disorienting about realizing the people who taught you about honesty may have crossed a legal line against you. Avery's tone softened slightly as she shifted from analysis to strategy. From this point forward, she said, you document everything. Every conversation, every message, every invoice. You do not engage in emotional arguments. You do not respond impulsively. Let the evidence speak. She advised me to gather all communications connected to the project texts between me and Camille emails. From my parents' correspondence from the construction company. She recommended requesting official copies of the permit applications from the county. She told me to avoid confronting Camille directly about the forgery until we had a formal plan in place. Silence isn't weakness, she added. It's control. That perspective steadied me more than she probably realized. I had been on the verge of storming back into my house and demanding accountability, hoping emotion alone would force someone to admit the truth. But Avery made it clear that emotional confrontation could complicate matters, especially if this progressed legally. When I left her office, the weight hadn't disappeared. If anything, it felt more defined. I wasn't just dealing with hurt feelings or crossed boundaries. I was facing the possibility that my sister had forged my name, my parents had supported it, and together, they had altered my home without consent. Driving back to the ranch, I understood something I hadn't fully accepted before. Protecting my boundaries might mean proving in a court of law, if necessary, that my own family committed fraud against me. And that realization was heavier than any wall they had torn down. 2 days after meeting with Avery, I woke up to a phone vibrating across my nightstand. Missed calls, several of them. Not from close friends, not from work. From relatives I hadn't spoken to in months. An aunt, a cousin, even a family friend who usually only reached out around holidays. That was the first sign something had shifted. I opened my social media accounts almost reluctantly, already sensing I wasn't going to like what I saw. At the top of my feed was Camille's name. A long post, paragraph after paragraph. She had written about feeling abandoned during a vulnerable time in her pregnancy, about how she had hoped her sister would step up but instead chose distance. She described herself as overwhelmed, emotional, unsupported. She never mentioned construction permits. She never mentioned contracts. She never mentioned a signature. But she described me in a way that made it clear who the villain was supposed to be. Cold, unyielding, selfish. I read it once, then again slower. The comments beneath it were multiplying by the minute. I can't believe she would treat you like that. Family should come first. You deserve better support. Each sentence landed with a dull weight. People were responding to the version of events they had been given. And that version was simple. A pregnant woman asking for help. A sister refusing. No one in that comment section knew that my name had been forged. No one knew that walls in my house had been torn down without consent. They were reacting to emotion, not documentation. Within hours, the post had spread beyond her immediate circle. Extended relatives began sharing it. Old acquaintances chimed in. Even neighbors who rarely engaged online started reacting with sympathy emojis and public messages of support. My phone began filling with direct messages. Some were passive-aggressive. Hope you too can work this out. Others were blunt. I'm disappointed in you. A few were openly hostile, accusing me of lacking compassion, of creating unnecessary conflict during what they framed as a delicate time for Camille. I felt the isolation before I fully processed it. It was subtle at first, a tightening in my chest, a quiet sense of being misrepresented in a room I wasn't allowed to enter. By mid-afternoon, I noticed something else. When I stepped outside to check the mailbox, a neighbor who usually waved enthusiastically offered a tight smile instead. Another lingered on their porch, just long enough to watch me walk back inside. Nothing confrontational, just different. It's unsettling how quickly perception can shift when a narrative spreads without challenge. The story had taken on a life of its own, and it was moving faster than truth ever could. For a moment, just a moment, I wanted to respond publicly. I wanted to write everything, to attach the scanned contract, to expose the forged signature, to demand that people reconsider their judgments. But I could hear Avery's voice in my mind. Silence isn't weakness, it's control. So instead of typing a rebuttal, I opened a new folder on my computer. I took screenshots of Camille's post. I captured every visible comment. I saved the timestamps. I archived the messages flooding into my inbox, supportive, critical, aggressive. I documented how quickly the narrative had spread and how it was shaping reactions around me. It felt mechanical at first, almost detached. But as the hours passed, I realized this was the only way to protect myself without escalating the situation further. Every time a new notification appeared, I resisted the urge to defend myself in real time. I reminded myself that public arguments rarely change minds. They just create more noise. Camille had chosen visibility. She had chosen sympathy. And she had done it knowing the full context wouldn't be included. That realization hurt more than the comments, because this wasn't just venting, it was strategy. She had framed the conflict emotionally, knowing most people respond to emotion faster than evidence. She positioned herself as vulnerable and me as rigid. It was a clean narrative, easy to digest, easy to share. Meanwhile, the truth was complicated. It involved permits and signatures and property law. It required patience to understand. And patience is not what social media rewards. As evening settled in, I scrolled through the post one last time before closing the app. The numbers had grown. More shares, more comments, more validation for a story that left out the most critical piece. I felt the distance expanding, not just between me and Camille, but between me and the community I had quietly been part of for years. And yet I didn't respond. Instead, I kept documenting. I saved the screenshots into organized folders. I labeled them by date and time. I backed them up to an external drive. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't satisfying, but it was steady. In that quiet act of preservation, I reclaimed a small sense of control. I couldn't stop people from believing what they wanted to believe. I couldn't force them to ask for my side before forming opinions. But I could ensure that when the time came, if the time came, there would be a clear record of what had been said and when. Restraint is uncomfortable. It feels unnatural when your name is being reshaped in public. But retaliation would have only fed the narrative that I was combative. So I chose stillness, not because I had nothing to say, but because the truth properly documented doesn't need to shout. By the end of that week, Avery had formally requested a review of the construction permits. I expected paperwork, delays, maybe a letter in the mail weeks later. I didn't expect a county inspector to call me early Monday morning asking for immediate access to my property. His tone was professional neutral. He explained that irregularities had surfaced in the permit filings connected to my address, and he needed to conduct an on-site evaluation. There was no accusation in his voice, just procedure. Still, my stomach tightened. When he arrived, he carried a thick folder and moved with the focus of someone who had handled disputes like this before. There was no small talk. I guided him to the section of the house where the walls had already been torn open and partially reframed. He began by reviewing the documents he brought from county records. The permit application listed Camille as the applicant. My property address was correct. The scope of work described structural expansion, load-bearing modifications included. He asked me directly, "Did you authorize these changes?" "No," I said. "Did you sign any document granting permission?" "No." He made a note, calm, methodical. Then he walked the altered perimeter of the living room, studying the exposed framing. He compared the physical structure to the submitted plans. Within minutes, his expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough for me to notice. He pointed to a section of support beams that had been repositioned. "These modifications don't match the approved diagrams," he said. He explained that certain structural changes required precise calculations to maintain foundational stability. The beams installed didn't align with the load distribution outlined in the paperwork. In simple terms, the house could have been compromised. That word compromised echoed. He continued inspecting wiring reroutes and partial wall extensions. Several elements failed to meet county safety guidelines. Some of the changes indicated that whoever submitted the plans either misunderstood the structural requirements or ignored them entirely. Then he addressed the authorization issue. If the property owner did not consent, he said carefully, the permit itself may have been improperly obtained. Improperly obtained. It was the first time someone outside my family had said in plain language that something about this process wasn't just messy, it was wrong. After nearly an hour, he closed his folder. Effective immediately, he said, all work must cease. The words landed with a kind of finality I hadn't heard since this began. He explained that any portion of the construction that failed compliance would need to be dismantled. The partially built sections could not remain in place if they violated structural code. Additionally, the listed applicant, Camille, would be required to respond to the county's request for clarification regarding the authorization and discrepancies in the submitted plans. There was no room for negotiation in his tone. For the first time since I'd come home to the sound of sledgehammers, the situation no longer felt like a private argument about family loyalty. It was now documented, reviewed, flagged by a regulatory body. That afternoon, my father arrived unannounced. He walked into the house with visible frustration, already aware that the inspector had been there. His first words weren't questions. They were accusations. "You've taken this too far," he said. He insisted the county was overreacting, that inspections always found minor issues, that it would have been fixed if I hadn't escalated it. I explained calmly what the inspector had said, that the beams didn't match approved diagrams, that structural stability was a concern, that the permit might have been improperly obtained. He waved it off. "It's paperwork," he snapped. "You're making it bigger than it needs to be." But this was no longer about how I felt. It wasn't about perceived selfishness or emotional sensitivity. A county official had reviewed the documentation and the physical structure and ordered work to stop. That's not an overreaction. That's enforcement. Shortly after my father left, my phone rang. Camille? Her voice carried a mix of indignation and urgency. She asked why the county had contacted her. She said someone from the office had requested additional documentation and questioned the authorization. I told her the inspector found discrepancies in the plans and issues with the structural modifications. I mentioned the stop work order. There was a pause, then defensiveness. I followed what the contractor told me, she said. "If something's wrong, it's not all on me." I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I simply repeated that the permit listed her as the applicant and that the county required clarification from her directly. She shifted the blame again toward the construction company, toward stress, toward confusion. But she never addressed the forged signature directly. By the end of the call, one thing was unmistakable. This was no longer a narrative she could shape online or dismiss as sibling conflict. The county had entered the picture. The documentation was under review. The structural violations were recorded. It had moved out of the realm of emotional storytelling and into formal regulatory scrutiny. And once something reaches that level, it becomes impossible to reduce it to a misunderstanding. The house stood partially dismantled around me, but for the first time, the foundation of the truth felt solid. A few days after the stop work order, the tension stopped hovering in the background and showed up at my front door. My father didn't call first. He just arrived, standing on the porch with that tight, controlled expression he uses when he's already decided how the conversation should end. My mother followed a few minutes later, her calm almost rehearsed. They didn't ask how I was holding up. They didn't ask what the inspector had said in detail. The focus was immediate and direct. "You need to withdraw the complaints," my father said. Not reconsider, not discuss. Withdraw. Insisted that if I had just allowed the expansion to continue, none of this would have escalated. The implication was clear. The chaos wasn't caused by forged documents or unauthorized construction. It was caused by me. My mother stepped in with a softer tone, but the message was the same. She said Camille had been under enormous stress, late pregnancy, emotional pressure, fear about space and stability. She described the forged signature as a desperate shortcut, not a deliberate act. "People make mistakes when they're overwhelmed," she said gently. "You don't destroy your family over it. Destroy." That word lingered longer than I expected. I asked them directly if either of them understood what it meant to sign someone else's name on a legal contract, to submit it to a county office, to begin structural changes on property that wasn't theirs. They shifted uncomfortably, but neither answered the question. Instead, they reframed it again. "Family helps. Family, you have more than enough space. Why are you being so rigid? Selfish, unreasonable." The labels came easily. When I reminded them that the inspector had identified structural violations and improper authorization, my father dismissed it as bureaucratic technicalities. He suggested that I was hiding behind legal language to avoid being compassionate. That was the moment something settled inside me, because compassion had never been the issue. Consent had. Later that evening after they left, frustrated and unconvinced, my inbox filled with messages from Camille. Not apologetic, not reflective, angry. She accused me of humiliating her, of dragging authorities into a private matter. She wrote that I had intentionally embarrassed her during a vulnerable time, that I was punishing her instead of supporting her. Each email grew sharper than the last. She didn't deny the forged signature. She didn't acknowledge the permit irregularities. She focused entirely on how my response made her feel. I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded every message to Avery. When she called me the next morning, her voice was steady but firmer than before. "This pattern matters," she said. "The pressure, the manipulation, the documented hostility, combined with the forged signature and the permit violations. This is no longer something that can be quietly resolved." She didn't use dramatic language. She didn't need to. Legal action was becoming inevitable. Hearing that felt strangely clarifying. Painful, but clarifying. Up until that point, a small part of me had still hoped there might be a conversation that fixed everything. A moment where someone admitted it went too far, where accountability softened the edges. But during that confrontation on my porch, I saw it clearly. My parents had already chosen sides. They weren't weighing facts. They weren't evaluating legality. They were protecting Camille. And in doing so, they were asking me to accept the violation quietly for the sake of harmony. Harmony built on silence. Standing alone in my living room after forwarding those emails, I realized something I hadn't wanted to face. protecting my boundaries might cost me the version of my family I thought I had. They viewed my refusal to withdraw the complaints as betrayal. I viewed their willingness to excuse fraud as something I could no longer ignore. And somewhere in that divide, the relationship we once had quietly broke. Not because I chose conflict, but because I chose not to pretend nothing had happened. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. No sweeping speeches, no dramatic pauses, just fluorescent lights, a wooden bench, and the steady hum of procedure. By the time the hearing began, I felt less like a daughter and more like a witness to something that had already broken. The first confirmation came quietly. The judge reviewed the deed and county filings, reading through them without expression. The ranch, every acre, every fence line, every beam of the house under dispute was titled solely in my name. No shared ownership, no informal agreements, no conditional language. It had been transferred to me years earlier, properly recorded, properly notarized. There was no ambiguity. Hearing it stated aloud in that measured official tone did something strange to my chest. I had never doubted it legally, but to have it confirmed in open court stripped away the last illusion that this was a family misunderstanding. The property was mine. What had happened inside it had not been a discussion. It had been an intrusion. Then the handwriting expert testified. A forensic document examiner laid the scanned contract on the evidence screen. He walked the court through the comparison, my verified signature on prior legal documents beside the one authorizing the construction expansion. At a glance, they looked similar. Same slant, same looping M, same confident tail at the end of my last name. But he slowed the analysis down. Pressure inconsistencies, pen lifts where mine never pause. A hesitation in the second L that doesn't exist in my authentic signature. The spacing between my first and last name slightly compressed, as if someone were copying from memory instead of instinct. These are not natural variations, he said calmly. They are indicators of simulation. The signature on the construction contract shows deliberate imitation. Deliberate. The word hung there longer than anything else that morning. My father shifted in his seat. Camille stared straight ahead. There were no gasps, no visible collapse. Just a tightening in the air, like everyone had silently crossed into new territory. When their attorney attempted to frame it as a misunderstanding, stress family assumptions, informal permission, the judge didn't entertain it for long. Emotional context, she said evenly, does not authorize the use of another individual's legal identity. It was the first time anyone in authority had said it plainly. This wasn't about sibling rivalry. It wasn't about hurt feelings. It was about misuse of documents, unauthorized construction, and financial decisions made under a false signature. Then came the financial disclosures. Through bank records and contractor testimony, it became clear that my father had transferred funds directly to cover the initial phase of construction. He had communicated with the company. He had approved modifications. He had attended site visits while I was out of state. Camille's name was on the contract, but he had been actively involved. He didn't deny it. He said he believed it was temporary, that we would work it out later, that it was easier to ask forgiveness than permission because we're family. The judge's response was measured but firm. Family relationships do not override property law. The consequences were methodical, not theatrical. First, full reimbursement for demolition and restoration of all non-compliant and unauthorized construction. The amount included contractor fees, material removal, structural assessment, and restoration to the original floor plan. Second, monitored payment arrangements through the court to ensure compliance. This wasn't optional repayment, it would be tracked. Third, administrative penalties related to the improper permitting process and submission of falsified authorization documents. And finally, the part that seemed to silence the room more than anything else, a 2-year no-contact order. Not dramatic, not permanent, but clear. No direct communication, no indirect contact through relatives, no unannounced visits to the ranch. Any necessary logistical matters would go through legal channels. My mother began to cry quietly at that point. My father's jaw hardened. Camille looked stunned, as if the outcome had exceeded the script she had imagined. I felt still, not triumphant, not vindicated in the cinematic sense, just steady, as if a long argument inside my own head had finally ended. When the gavel came down, it wasn't loud. It didn't echo. It simply marked the end of something that had been unraveling for months. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon light felt almost too bright. The parking lot was ordinary cars, unlocking people, checking phones, life continuing without ceremony. Avery stood beside me, reviewing the paperwork one last time. "This gives you clarity," she said softly. Clarity, it was the right word. But clarity doesn't feel like celebration. I had protected my home. The ranch was intact. The law had drawn a boundary where my family refused to. There would be restoration. There would be oversight. There would be distance, but there would also be absence. For 2 years, there would be silence enforced by court order, no holidays negotiated, no casual Sunday calls. No pretending this could be brushed aside. As I walked down the courthouse steps, I realized something I hadn't prepared for justice doesn't repair the version of your family you thought you had. It just defines what is legally acceptable moving forward. The relief was quiet and physical, like setting down a weight I'd been carrying in my shoulders for months. But beneath it was grief, not explosive, not theatrical, just a steady recognition that protecting myself had required acknowledging who they were willing to be. The ranch still belonged to me, that was clear. What it would look like without them, that was the part no judge could rule on. Months later, nothing collapsed all at once. There were no public apologies, no dramatic reckonings, just adjustments, small, steady recalibrations that carried their own weight. I heard through relatives that Camille sold her car, not the oldest one, the newer model she'd proudly posted about last spring. The court-monitored payments had begun, and the math apparently required sacrifice. There were no more photos of weekend drives or spontaneous trips. Her online presence grew quieter, less curated. Even Blake, who had once treated the renovation like an exciting upgrade, seemed to be recalculating. Changes to routine, tighter budgets, fewer assumptions about what was guaranteed. My father felt it differently. A loan application he'd expected to glide through stalled instead. Violation records, administrative penalties tied to the unauthorized construction had become part of his financial profile. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to complicate approvals, to trigger additional scrutiny, to slow what once moved quickly. He wasn't accustomed to being questioned on paper. My mother's shift was more subtle. Community gatherings continued, but invitations arrived less directly. Conversations shortened. People who once leaned in with easy warmth now kept a careful neutrality. No one said much outright. Still, distance has its own language. I watched all of it from the edge of my own restored porch, aware that consequences rarely explode. They settle, they redistribute, they show up in smaller decisions: what gets sold, what gets denied, who steps back. It wasn't satisfying, it was simply real. The court had drawn lines, but life carried them forward quietly, one adjustment at a time. Restoring the ranch was less dramatic than tearing it apart had been. It was measured, scheduled, documented. Contractors arrived on time. Walls were opened carefully this time. Wiring inspected, beams reinforced properly. I walked each room with a clipboard, asking questions I hadn't known to ask before. Permits were visible. Approvals were signed in my presence. Every nail felt intentional. The house slowly returned to its original footprint. The extra framing came down. The compromised sections were rebuilt to code. When the final inspection passed, it wasn't a celebration. It was a quiet exhale. Tessa Monroe came out one weekend while the painters were finishing the living room. She didn't offer dramatic comfort. She brought coffee, sat cross-legged on the porch, and listened. When I talked about court dates and signatures and what it feels like to watch your own family cross a line, she didn't rush to soften it. She just nodded and said, "You did what you had to do." Inside, the fresh paint covered more than patched drywall. It covered the outline of where something unauthorized had tried to expand without permission. I realized that's what I was doing internally too, rebuilding boundaries with reinforcement instead of hope. I stopped waiting for a message that would fix everything. Stopped imagining a future conversation where someone finally understood. Emotional distance stopped feeling temporary and started feeling settled. The ranch stands the way it was meant to now. Solid, lawful, quiet. And so do I. The adjacent lot went up for sale late that fall. I didn't tell anyone I was considering it. I walked it alone first, boots and dry grass wind cutting across open space that had once felt peripheral to my life. The boundary line ran unevenly along the fence, a quiet reminder that land, like relationships, is defined whether you acknowledge it or not. This time I chose deliberately. The purchase closed without fanfare. No family discussion, no shared excitement. Just my signature, my real one placed carefully on documents I had read line by line. Expanding the ranch felt different now. Not like an indulgence, not like a performance. It felt like reclamation. We cleared the brush in sections and mapped out an orchard near the southern edge, where the soil tested strongest. Rows of young trees went in peach, pear, apple, thin trunks, staked upright against the wind. Planting them required patience. I didn't always feel, but I showed up anyway. Healing, I was learning, doesn't demand inspiration. It demands consistency. I carved walking paths through the new acreage gravel, pressed into earth, curves intentional instead of accidental. The paths weren't about exercise, they were about movement without intrusion, about knowing where I could step without bracing. Near the back corner, where the light stretches longest in the late afternoon, I built an outdoor studio. Simple structure. open windows, a long table facing the fields. It wasn't extravagant, but it was mine, designed without negotiation, approved without persuasion. A place to think without anticipating interruption. I stopped apologizing in small ways, stopped softening my explanations when people asked what happened, stopped saying it's complicated. It wasn't complicated anymore. It was clear. Protecting my home and my name had not been cruelty. It had been maintenance. There has been no contact, no holiday messages, no indirect updates beyond what drifts through extended relatives. The silence is strange, an absence that hums in the background. Sometimes it feels like emptiness, like a room that used to hold noise and now holds air. Other times, it feels like stability, like the steady quiet of land that isn't being trespassed. Both can exist at once. On certain evenings, I walk the new paths as the orchard settles into dusk. The trees are still young. They won't bear real fruit for a few seasons. I find comfort in that timeline, growth that can't be rushed, roots strengthening beneath the surface where no one can see. I used to think healing would feel decisive, like crossing a finish line. It hasn't. It feels like choosing the same boundary over and over until it becomes habit. It feels like reading contracts fully, like keeping records, like locking gates without guilt. The ranch is larger now, but more than that, it's clearer. The fences mark what is mine. The studio stands where I placed it. The orchard grows because I planted it. Peace didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated through steady choices, through enforced silence, through refusing to shrink to keep someone else comfortable. I don't celebrate the distance from my family. I accept it. And in that acceptance, something solid has taken root. I didn't set out to draw lines this hard. I just learned that self-respect sometimes asks you to stand still when everything familiar pulls at you. Rebuilding isn't loud. It's steady. It's choosing peace, even when it costs you comfort. Thank you for staying with me through this chapter. If stories rooted in growth and honesty matter to you, I'm glad you're here. There's strength in protecting what's yours and in trusting yourself to do it.